right, Parshat Vayishlach. Again, as we've been doing, this will be Le'ilei Nishmat Shmuel Aryeh ben Naftali Hertz and Nechama Batya bat Avraham Yitzchak, and also, as we did last week as well, Ovadia's uncle Moshe. I don't remember Moshe what his mother's name was, but it should be Le'ilei Nishmato. There's a story they tell of the guy goes into a psychologist. He's going to do they're going to do a test. They want to see if he's sane. So they decide to do a Rorschach test, right? You guys know what a Rorschach test is? Like the ink blots they show you, right? So they show him the first one. He says, what do you see? And he says, that's a murder scene. Someone bashed someone's head in with a hammer. He goes, okay. He shows him another one. What's that? He's like, that's a dead guy. He got run over by a truck. The guy's like, all right, here's one more. So what do you see? Is that's a plane crash. The guy goes, psychologist says, I got to tell you, I think you're a little nuts. He goes, I'm nuts. You're the one who's showing me all the violent pictures. Right? So, I've often said that Torah in a certain way is like a Rorschach test. There's a lot in it. There's a lot of different views in it. And depending on where you want to go with it, you can kind of see what you want. And we're going to specifically see that tonight. And just, by way of just a further introduction, when I was a kid, it was 1985. I looked it up today. There was this TV show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Alfred Hitchcock was he was a famous movie director, and all these kind of psychological twists. And they used to have a TV show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And in 1985, when I was the young age of 14, long time ago, they revived it, and it was kind of, again, it was a lot of very interesting twists. And I looked up today, there's an episode I've been talking about for a long time, and I looked up today, appropriately enough, the title is Revenge. And basically it tells a story, there's this guy, and he's sitting at home, and his wife comes home, and she's totally, something as really bad has happened. And he says, what's the matter? And she's like, I was attacked by this guy. I don't remember if she says, she was assaulted, she was raped. I don't remember exactly what it was. And the husband's like, okay, we're going to go out, we're going to find him, we're going to, take care of him. They go out in the car, they're driving for a little while, they pass the man, and she goes, oh my God, that's him. He goes, you sure? Yeah, that's him. They pull over the car, he chases the guy down, he corners him, the guy's like, what are you doing? He's like, you attacked my wife. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, you're a liar. And he goes and he beats him up, and he kills him, gets back in the car, they're driving home, and the next guy she passes by, she goes, that's him. And that's the way the episode ends. And I've long used this as a kind of mashal, that, the Jewish people throughout our history, we've had a very long history of dealing with people who were not necessarily our biggest fans. And to a certain degree, various non-Jewish nations, different religions, and to a certain degree, we kind of see, unfortunately, to this very day, people, I think, to some degree, see, anytime they see a non-Jew, they see, another Cossack, or another Nazi, or whatever it is. And, in this shiur, we're going to kind of see how that potentially comes up, and maybe the possible ways that we can get past that. So again, this week's Parshat is Parshat Vayishlach. Yaakov is finally returning to Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, after being in Lavan's house. And on his way back, he realizes he might meet up with Eisav, and he decides to take things into his own hands. And he goes and he sends out messengers. He wants to see what's going to be going on. And the messengers come back. Bad news. Not only is Eisav, did we meet up with Eisav, but he's got 400 men. And the assumption of almost all the Mefarshim, not quite all, but almost all of them, is that the 400 men are not there for positive reasons. They're basically coming to attack him, and he becomes very, very afraid. And yet, lo and behold, when they actually meet up, things don't turn out exactly as expected, right? In Perek Lamed Gimel, when they finally meet up, and they go, and all the children bow down, and the wives bow down, and finally they finally meet up, and what does he do? Here we go. Perek Lamed Gimel Pasuk Daled Vayarat Eisav likrato v'yichabkehu, right? Eisav ran to greet him, and he hugged him. Vayipol al tzavarav, and he fell on his neck. Vayishakehu, and he kissed him. Vayivku, and they cried. Now, if you look over here in the word in Vayishakehu, the word Vayishakehu has dots on it. Now, I don't want to be heretical and talk about what dots could possibly mean, but we'll just when there's dots in the Torah, there's definitely something going on in terms of exactly how to read that word, whether they belong there. And Rashi actually says right here, he says,
what do you mean dots?
Literally, there's like dots on top of the actual letters. There's like some sort of little...
On top of every letter, there's like a period.
Yeah.
Like a dot, like a bullet point. On top
in the Torah, which again, usually there's no nikudot. Here there are these dots on top of it. So Rashi says, nakud alav, there are dots on it. V'yesh cholkim b'davar b'braita desifri. There's actually different opinions on this kiss. Yesh darshu nikudazu lomar shelo nashku b'chol libo. Some understand it to mean that he didn't really kiss him with all his heart. Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and very famous words here, which is going to be the crux of what we're going to deal with. Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, halachahi, very strange language. Halacha usually means a law, but here it's kind of hard to understand what that would be. Halachahi, it's a halacha biyadua she'Eisav Soneih Yaakov. That Eisav hates Yaakov. It doesn't say that Eisav hated Yaakov, even though they lived a long time before Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. El shenichmeru rachama b'ota sha'a v'neshko b'chol libo. So according to this approach, even though Eisav generally hated him, at this moment it was a very real kiss. There's actually a midrash brought down in the Targum Yonatan ben Uziel brings it down that really Eisav went to bite him, and Yaakov's neck turned to stone, and that's why they cried. It hurt Eisav's teeth, and Yaakov's neck, I guess, it got literally a stiff neck. But again, there's this idea that Eisav Soneih at Yaakov, and this is. So the question is what does this mean? Is this just talking about the historical person Eisav hates Yaakov, and you shouldn't think that anything changed here, or is it something bigger? And the truth is, over the past about 2,000 years, a little bit less than that, Yaakov and Eisav have become sort of like a typology for the Jewish people and the Christians. First Rome and then the Christians. In other words, instead of just being a story about Yaakov and Eisav, it became that Yaakov was the representation of the Jewish people, Eisav was the representation of Rome / Christianity. And some people, and literally you'll see it today, and it drives me crazy when I see this, but people see whenever anything bad happens to Jews, especially in certain religious circles, will just say, people will say, Eisav Soneih Yaakov, it's just a fact, it's a halacha, whatever, they use that as if it's some sort of a guarantee, they will always hate us. Which again, for those of us who are, growing up, in the, 21st century, who are not, who didn't grow up in a world with, so much anti-Semitism around them, it's kind of a depressing sort of way to look at it. That there's this eternal battle between all nations and us, and we're just always going to be hated. There's nothing we could do. And yet, so Rashi quotes this over here, and the truth is, if you look, as we're going to see, it's not just Rashi, the Ramban as well. Earlier in the Parshat, right at the beginning, the Ramban says, let me find this. Right, he goes and when he splits up the entire, he splits up the entire camp. And then he says, "V'al dati gam ze yirmoz." This is the Ramban. Ki anachnu hitchalnu nefilatenu biyad Edom. Again, here you see already Edom means Rome, even though, as we'll see, it's not so simple that that's true. Ki malchei bayit sheni ba'u bebrit im haromaim umehem shaba'u beroma. Okay, v'hi hayta sibat nefilatam biyadam. Okay, so he says that there seems to be this whole thing going on with the Romans, and that this was actually. That this is already that this already almost symbolizes that, right? The Ramban has this famous concept, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, whatever happened to the Avot, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov happened later on to Bnei Yisrael. Right, basically history repeats itself, and so he says that already this is alluding to Rome, and later on he actually goes and he says, let me see if I can find it over here. Why
specifically Rome?
So we're going to see. We're going to see why specifically where this comes from. And he says, "V'gam ze yirmo shelo yigzeru aleinu b'nei Eisav limchod et shemenu." Right, the whole thing. Because what does Yaakov do? He splits up the camp and he prays and he sends a bribe. So and why does he split up the camp? He says because this way, if they attack one group, the other one will survive. And listen to what the Ramban says. He says, "Zeir Moshe lo yigzeru aleinu b'nei Eisav limchod et shemenu." They'll mistreat some of us in some of the Christian lands. One Christian king will decide to take away our money or kill us. Ramban says, just like Yaakov split them up so that the whole Jewish people wouldn't have been wiped out, that's how it's going to be in Galut. Yes, we're going to face the Romans. Yes, we're going to face, as the Ramban would put it also, we're going to face the these Christians who want to wipe us out. But just like Yaakov split them up, so they wouldn't be destroyed. That's why we're all split up in Galut, so that that way, if one king decides he's going to allow pogroms or whatever it's going to be, the other ones will survive. So they take this very, very serious, right? And and basically they start seeing, again, not just Eisav as a person, but Eisav as a typology, as representing the Romans and the Christians, right? To the point that, in a pasuk, which I know we say it in Malchiot, I don't know if you guys do as well, in Sefer Ovadia, which again is one of the Treyasar, not too often that we say it, right? Famous pasuk, "Va'alu Mosheim b'Har Tzion lishpot et Har Eisav v'aytal Hashem hamlucha." Right? There's this whole idea that somehow Eisav is going to be judged in the future. And again, they understand this. What does that mean that Eisav is going to be judged? It doesn't mean Eisav himself. Eisav is dead already. Who's it going to be? The people of Eisav. So the question is, where does this come from? Right? Because again, the Pashtut, this is just a story about, the two sons of Yitzchak, Yaakov and Eisav, and yet all of a sudden it's been turned into this whole epic, eternal battle between the Jewish people and the Romans and / the Christians. So again, in terms of, just to give credit where credit is due, as I mentioned, there's a professor, his name is Professor Alan Brill, used to be at YU, now he's at Seton Hall. So he sent me a number of different articles, one of which is like the classic article on this. There was someone at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the conservative seminary in Manhattan. His name was Gerson D. Cohen, and he wrote the article. I mean, every other article that I found, they all quoted. He wrote the article on what it means, this whole Yaakov-Eisav Judaism Christian thing. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be based on it, although not everything. So he points out that this doesn't start right away. In other words, you have a long time between when Eisav dies and when this starts. He says, when exactly does it start? He says, basically, if you look, let's say, basically, to use my son, Ushi's, phrase, he basically became a Torah, detective, he wanted to search out, where do we find this? Basically, you start looking up, where does this first appear? Because again, as we're going to see, and that's why I said before, in terms of that, that Alfred Hitchcock presents, as we're going to see, depending on when the different Chachamim lived, and to some degree even where they lived, it very much influenced how they saw Eisav. So that if you lived in a time where you were being afflicted by the Romans or by the Christians, it was almost like a natural fit that you would start seeing, that you would read this in as being talking about the days that you're in. So he points out that the first time it appears in a midrash, in Midrash Rabbah, right from last week's pasuk, Parshat, Hakol Kol Yaakov Yadayim Yidei Eisav. Right, so it says, so Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai Hayad Doresh Hakol Kolo Shel Yaakov. Right, what is Yaakov calling out about? What's his voice? Mitzavcha mimasha asulo hayadayim yidei Eisav. He's calling out, he's screaming out in pain because of what Esav's hands did to him. Right? And just in case we don't, make the connection, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kolo shel Adrianus, it's the voice of Hadrian, Caesar, the Caesar, Shaharag bebeitar, Pei Elef Ribo Bnei Adam, 800,000 people. So again, starting over here, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, who's one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and we're going to see Rabbi Akiva as well, they start talking about Eisav being Rome. Now, what do we know about Rabbi Akiva? When did Rabbi Akiva live?
Rome.
He lived right in the time of the Romans, right? The Beit HaMikdash is destroyed in 70 CE. About 60 years later, the Jews decide to rebel. And very famously, Rabbi Akiva is the one who comes up with, the idea that what's it called? That Bar Kochva is the Mashiach, and that if we look in the. If we look in Parshat Balak, right later, like towards the end, after he's given all the curses in Perach Avdalad, it says, he starts giving his mashal again. Right, Erenu v'lo ata, I see it, and now Asherenu v'lo karov, I see it, but it's not so close. Darach kochav miYaakov, v'kam shevet miYisrael. Right, okay, there's going to be this star which is going to come up from Yaakov. And who did Rabbi Akiva say this was talking about? Who was the Mashiach according to Rabbi Akiva? Bar Kochva, right? His name was Bar Koziva, right? But he called him Bar Kochava, Bar Kochva, Derech Kochav miYaakov. So Rabbi Akiva starts seeing, the Romans are, fighting against the Jews, right? And then it continues and it says in Pasuk Yutet, Vayerd miYaakov, and someone will go down from Yaakov, Havid Sarid Me'ir, and will go and destroy the remnant of Ir. Ir does not mean city. I mean, it's a specific place. And Rashi says, Me'ir Hatoshava Shel Edom Hiromi. Rashi says this is talking about Rome. And again, so you have Rabbi Akiva, you have Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai saying that this is talking about Rome. Because what's going on? Basically, as you read Tanakh, you have this idea that the Jewish people are Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, Vatam Tiyuli, that you are, you're my treasure, you're my holy people, you're my chosen people, and everything is fine. You have a Beit HaMikdash, it gets destroyed, fine, you come back, but all of a sudden the second Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, and things start to go bad. Right? And if you're the chosen people, shouldn't things be going good for you? Mm-hmm. So you start right. So one of the things that starts happening, and this is always risky business, is to what degree can you look at any nivuah in the Torah and say, when it says this, it's really talking about the Nazis or it's talking about the Spanish Inquisition. It's a very dangerous game because really, who knows? And just when you think you've got into it matches up perfectly, who knows? But again, as they start to see a very big distinction between what they think should be happening, the Jews should be on top, and what's actually happening, the Jews are getting defeated. So they start seeing this as, this is some part of like a bigger cosmic battle that's taking place as predicted in Tanakh. It's the people of Yaakov, the Jewish people, versus the people of Rome, and this is going to, this is going to be this eternal battle until Mashiach comes, right? And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai even says, and we're going to come back to this later on, right, there's in Sefer Daniel, right, I'm always happy when I, prepare for the shiur and I actually get to open up, like, some of the svarim from, Nach, because like, when am I ever going to learn Sefer Daniel? So, in Sefer Daniel, right, a lot of it's in Aramaic, which makes it even more challenging. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it's actually sort of similar to Paro's dreams in Shemot. I'm sorry, in Bereshit. He has these dreams, only in this case, not only does Nebuchadnezzar not know what they mean, he doesn't even remember the dream. But Nebuchadnezzar is not a nice guy, and he says, he basically calls his, the wise people together, and he says, you need to tell me what my dream was and what it meant. And they're basically like, dude, tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it meant. And he's like, no, tell me what the dream was, and tell me what it meant, or I'm going to kill you. They're like, what are you supposed to do? So he's like, okay, fine, I'll kill you all. And he says he's going to kill all the wise people of Bavel. That's it. And Daniel hears about this, and Daniel, Daniel basically prays to God, and God, again, almost like Yosef, he gets brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and he explains the dream to him. And basically, in the dream, there's this statue, and his head is of gold, and then there's silver. It's basically like these more or less 4 sections, and it's supposed to represent. It's generally understood to represent these 4 galuyot, right? These 4 exiles, and then the last one, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who again is also this is right around the time of Rabbi Akiva, is again the last one is going to be Rome. So you have this whole picture that forms that that Rome, who's oppressing them now, this is not something permanent. This is not something that's going to last forever. This is this is part of the cosmic plan. And this way, we're not down, for good, we're just down for evil. Right? And they even find proof for it. Whoops, I guess I didn't bring in... Okay, I guess I didn't bring it in. But if we look in... if you look in Megillat Eicha and Perek Daled, there it also, right, it talks about that... that Rome is going to, that Rome are the ones who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, and again, and they understand this to be, Edom destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, and they understand this to be talking about Rome. And this is important because the truth is, up until now, Eisav is not, Rome can't really be Eisav, because Eisav, as a descendant of Abraham and Yitzchak, comes from Shem. But the Jewish people, actually, for a long time, there already was a tradition that goes back in Perek Yud, when, in Noach, when it's going through all the different generations, it says, Ve'ele told Bnei Noach, Shem, Cham, v'Yafet. Now it starts going through Yafet's children, Bnei Yafet, Gomer, Umagog, Madai, Yavan. Okay, Greece. Okay, and then in Pasuk Daled, Ubnei Yavan, Elisha, V'Tarshish, Kitim, V'Dodanim. And if you look, the Ibn Ezra says, who are these Kitim? And he says, it's Malchut Yavan V'Romi. It's the Greeks and the Romans. So you have a problem, because the Jews are saying the Romans are Eisav, but the truth is that really, the Romans, according to Jewish tradition, are not from Eisav. So that's going to be...
Maybe Jewish father.
But in terms of in terms of the father, it should be going through the really descendant of Yefet, not a descendant of Shem, the way Eisav is. So again, so they look in Eicha, which we read on Tisha B'Av, and it talks about Rome it talks about Edom destroying the Beit HaMikdash, and they say, okay, that doesn't mean Bayit Rishon, it's really Nevuah, Bayit Sheni, it's really talking about Rome, and little by little, Rome ultimately starts to transform into Christianity, right? Because as we know, right? Basically, in Constantine in the 4th century, it becomes the official religion. But it starts off again. So it sort of starts off with Rome, and little by little, it starts to change. And there's this tremendous tension going on with the Christians, because the Christians, of course, instead of saying, they're saying, you're not down now temporarily. You're down now for good. God has rejected you. You are, the Jewish people have been totally rejected, and all the prophecies have come true. And Jesus is the Messiah, you're not coming back, and you're done. And, there starts to be this tremendous tension. And not only that, but the Christians even turn it up a little bit more. Not only do the Christians say it's not true that we're really that we're really Eisav, they actually turn the tide on the Jews, and they start saying, you've actually got it backwards. You guys are Eisav, we're Yaakov. Right? And they start to say, well, that makes sense. Right? After all, right? After all, right? And the Epistle Paul says this, right? He says that, after all, the whole thing is that what do we see in Breshit constantly? That there's an actual Bechor, there's an actual older son who starts off as for, who should be the chosen one, but really a younger son comes along, and the Jewish people are the older son, they're the ones who were here before us, and now you've been rejected, just like, Yishmael was rejected in favor of Yitzchak, and just like Eisav was rejected in favor of Yaakov, you guys are the older religion, and you've been rejected in favor of Christianity. So, you've got the Jews saying, that the Christians are Eisav, but the Christians are actually turning the tide. And we're going to actually come back to this, but Abarbanel, who I've already mentioned a bunch of times, he gets really, he gets actually really furious, because there was a different Paul of Burgos, or I don't know, Burgos, I don't know how it's pronounced, comes along and he says, tell you even more than that, right? The Gemara says, I think it's in Masechet Eruvin, it's either in Shabbat or Eruvin, I think it was Eruvin, that Rabbi Meir is a descendant of the Edomim. So he says, and a lot of the Gemara is based on Rabbi Meir, who's a student of Rabbi Akiva, and Paul of Burgos comes along and is telling the Christians, see, the Jews are Edom, the Jews are the descendants of Eisav, they've been rejected, and we can see later on the Abarbanel tries to solve all of this. But little by little, the Christians start to adapt this imagery at the same time. And Gershon Cohen points out, they're not both purposely taking it from each other. It's kind of happening separately. The Jews are trying to hold on to this idea that we're still the chosen people, and the Christians are kind of trying to hold on to this idea that the Jews have been rejected. And each one kind of independently ends up with it. And as the Jews rebel, in 70 when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, the early Christians see that as a sign that the Jews are being rejected. And then in around 130, when the Jews rebel, Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba, and they lose again, the Christians are even stronger. Oh, you see, the Jews are being rejected, right? And then, right? Basically, as they're being, as it's going on, they're actually rejoicing. And then they start adding on, just like we see, now they're not just saying we're the descendants, then they start saying the same thing. The Jews are Eisav, right? They are the people who, basically have been rejected. It's not just they're the descendants of the rejected one, but they are rejected. This is where you start getting into the whole idea of, the Jews as the devil and the Jews as, the Antichrist and all these kind of things. But still, at least, in the 3rd century, you still at least have that the Christians are still not so strong themselves. Rome is also oppressing the Christians. When things get really, really bad is when, as we said before, Constantine, declares, Christianity as the official religion of Rome. And all of a sudden, it seems very, very clear that Christianity has won and the Jews have lost. And now it's not just a claim about being a descendant. It's not just a claim about, you guys represent Eisav, but even politically, they've now put it into theory as a political theory. The Jews are rejected politically. The Christians are on top. Jews are not allowed to own Christian slaves. Basically, and again, all of a sudden, this whole view of the Jews being Eisav is now put into practice, and the Jews officially become this despised, put down religion. So you've got this huge problem now where, again, it appears that Christianity is winning. It appears that that the Jews are being rejected. And this, so again, this kind of sets the stage for the Middle Ages when all of a sudden, again, as I said before, you already had Ramban, you already have Rashi, and you have a Barbanel who all sort of say that, no, it's not true. The Jews are really descendants of Yaakov. Again, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, the church has already set up the Jews are Eisav, and the Jews are desperately trying to prove that really, no, the Christians are Eisav. And again, we have this problem because, again, according to Jewish tradition, how could Eisav be Edom? Edom is from a different descendant. So you have an attempt to, you have the Abarbanel, a long, at the end of Perek Lamed Hey in Yeshayahu, he goes through this whole long description of 2 ways to prove that the Jews are really Yaakov and Rome is really Eisav. Yeah.
Do they use the whole idea of them being actually subservient, or do they actually use the phrase Eisav and Yaakov?
Right, no, they're actually, I'm saying they're actually taking that phrase. They're literally, again, just like the Jews are saying that, we are Yaakov, and even, Rome might be up for a while, and Eisav might be up for a while, and Christian might be up for a while, but we're going to come back, and they're saying, no, you've been rejected, we are Yaakov, we're the ones who are victorious. So again, so along comes the Abarbanel.
What does he have to prove?
Well, he wants to
specifically says in the Torah.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. It doesn't. That's the problem. It's according to Jewish tradition. Until this comes along, the Romans are not descendants of Eisav. They're a descendant of Yefet, who comes from a different family.
Not about the Romans, but
right.
But to prove that Jews come from Yaakov.
No. Well, but remember, again, he's not using it as a literal point anymore. It's a typology. It's who represents Yaakov. Remember, within the Christian view, it's Eisav is the older brother who's been rejected. That's the Jews. The Jews are the big brother. Christianity comes out from it. And just like in the rest of Bereshit, the Jews have been rejected. God has chosen this new religion. See, Abarbanel comes up with 2 different ways to try to prove that the Jews are really, that the Christians are really Eisav. And they are what they are. The first one is, he quotes from a book called Yosifun, which Yosifun is this kind of Jewish adaptation of Josephus. Basically, it's written about around the year 1000, a little bit before the year 1000, probably in Italy, and it says it's giving over the history of the world, although again, a lot of stuff in there is folklore. And basically within there it starts saying that that Eisav had this grandson, and this grandson got taken hostage in Egypt, and somehow he escaped, and he ends up in Rome, and it goes through this entire description in Sefer Yosifun, which again, the Jews of the time, the Jews of the Middle Ages, didn't know that this work was not a really historically accurate book. But basically what this comes out, because again, you have the problem, because Edom really, if you look at where is Har Seir? Har Seir is not in Italy, it's right next to Eretz Yisrael. So how are you going to say that Eisav is Rome? if that's not where they end up. So they come up based on, his first explanation based on Sefer Yosifun is that Rome was really founded by this descendant of Eisav, who first he ended up in Egypt, and then he ended up over there, he ended up, kind of escaping over there, and he built Rome. So one of the things is that according to this first explanation, the Romans really do descend from Eisav, because, a descendant of Eisav founded Rome. Which again, we know not to be true, but again, in the Middle Ages, the Jews thought that this was true. And then he comes up with a second possibility. He says, you know what? Maybe they're not literally Rome, but when we say that Eisav is Rome, we don't mean the country of Rome, we mean the religion of Rome, right? So it might be that Rome at first was represented by Avodah Zarah, but later it's represented by Christianity. And he tries to bring all these proofs, basically, that Christianity, that's what it means when it says that Eisav is Rome. It doesn't mean the nation of Rome, but it means the religion of Rome. And we said before, not only does the Abarbanel do this, but the Ibn Ezra as well. The Ibn Ezra who, remember we said with Daniel that there are those 4 nations, right? Which up until then we had assumed that the Christians are the last nation. The Ibn Ezra comes along now and he says, no, the 3rd nation is Greece/Rome, and it's really Yishmael that's going to be the 4th nation. Again, they try to play around and they try to create a way that really, it maybe is not literally, doesn't mean the country of Rome, but it means the religion. And, the Barbanel goes so far, I saw this yesterday, I thought this was wild, the Barbanel goes so far as to say that Jesus was the reincarnation of Eisav. Right, even plays around with the letters, Yeshua, Eisav, right? The letters could be the same, and that he's really the reincarnation. And again, they try to make this whole idea that Christianity is this, that all the times when it talks about Edom and these people who are going to be rejected, and Rome, this is always talking about the Christians. Now, the thing of course to point out, and then this is what I said beforehand, is that if you're living in a certain time, it's not so hard to see the Christians as representing Eisav, right? Because when does Rashi live? Rashi lives during the time of the Crusades, right? Some of his Perush actually on Eicha, he actually even references the Crusades, right? He lives in the late 11th century. They're being attacked. The Abarbanel, when does he live? I was looking this up. I'm pretty sure he wrote his Perush after he was kicked out of Spain, right? He's the one who talks about, just like the Ramban does, that there are going to be times where the Jewish people were never going to be completely destroyed. One king might reject us and another lets us in. Wow, that's totally autobiographical. Remember, he gets kicked out of Spain where he was the finance minister and gets absorbed in, I believe, to Portugal, right? The Ramban is in the famous, dispute in 1263. So again, the fact that they're seeing the Christians as this kind of evil empire, and the ones who've been talked about in Tanakh, and they're Eisav, it's not crazy. In other words, and that's basically where you end up through the Middle Ages. You now have this thing where, again, the Christians are saying the Jews have been rejected, and we're really Yaakov, and the Jews are saying, no, you're Eisav, you're going to be rejected, in the end the Jews are going to come back, and there's this kind of sense that there are these two people, and again, we've spoken about even before, there's, the Midrash that when one is up, the other's down, it's this like eternal battle that exists. And that's pretty much what goes on through the Middle Ages. You don't really see any sense of reconciliation. But interestingly, and again, depending on when you're living in history, you start to see a little bit of a reconciliation in the last 500 years as Jews are living in times and places where there's at least hope that anti-Semitism is on the way down and the Jews are going to be okay. So we're just going to look at a couple of examples of where we see that. First of all, there's a midrashic work called Seder Eliyahu Zuta. It's written. It's a late midrash, and it talks about the shiur la'azazel. Right? If you remember on Yom Kippur, there was the avodah in the Beit Hamikdash, and one of the things that had happened was that the Kohen Gadol, they had 2 identical goats that were brought to him, and he drew lots, and one was given La Hashem, and one was given La Azazel. And the Midrash picks up on a very interesting idea that says, why are they exactly the same? What do they represent? They represent twins. Okay? The 2 goats represent twins, right? It says, so it says as follows, right? So what's going to happen in the future? Right? It says, Shalu Talmidav, I think at Rabbi Eliezer, V'amrulo, Minayin Shatira Kadosh Baruch Hu Laso Nekama Be'amalek Ba'atzmo. Where do we know that he's going to do Nekama in Amalek? Now the important thing to know when you're talking about in the Middle Ages, when they start talking about Amalek, who are they really talking about? Amalek doesn't exist anymore. But again, you have to remember, they're living among the Christian censors. So they start, so again, in the Gemara, any place that, they don't want to get censored, they start talking about nations that no longer exist. But generally, if it talks about something that's going to happen with Amalek, it's generally really talking about the Christians. So it says, how do we know that God's going to judge them? So he says as follows, right? The pasuk says, Mizeh ba me Edom. Who's coming from Edom? And it talks about God coming from Edom, and he's got these red clothes. So it says, why is this happening? Right? What does it represent that you're going to have these two goats? One of them is going to go to Hashem, and one of them Azazel. One of them is going to be dashed on a cliff. So what does it represent? He's going to put all the Jewish people's sins on Amalek, on the Christians. By the way, it really almost sounds like Christian imagery, right? Like that, all our sins are going to be taken by this, by the scapegoat, right? Al Amalek harasha, okay, sheba'u me Eisav. Shneamar v'nasa hasa'ir alav et kol avonotam. He'll bear all their sins. Now listen to what it says. Bo'tasha amar Amalek lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amalek, the Christians come before God and they say, V'chi ma kochi shnatata li kol avonot Yaakov. God, how can you give me all of their sins? Bo'tasha notel HaKadosh Baruch Hu kol avonot Yaakov. God takes the avonot of Yaakov and oten al bigadav. He puts on his own clothes. Okay? In this one, rather than his clothes being, right, in other words, the classic way of understanding this pasuk, or why are God's clothes red when he's coming from Edom? Because what is he going to do in the future? Valu Moshe in Bahar Tzion. God is going to pay the Romans back. He's going to go to Har-Eisav, and what is he going to do? Kill them all. But according to this midrash, what's going on? God takes the sins instead, and Eisav is forgiven. You start seeing over here for the first time this possibility of a reconciliation where the Jews and Eisav both survive. Now this is already a long time ago. This is over 1,000 years ago, but at least you have this possibility that it's not going to end with. In other words, up until now it's been this thing where like the assumption has been the Jewish people are going to in the end be redeemed, Va'alu Moshe Bahar Tzion, and then God's going to punish them. You already start to see in this midrash a sense that maybe that's not going to happen.
When was it written?
And it's written already. It's written in the year 1000. It's not again in the Middle Ages. It's certainly far from the typical view, but the view exists. You start having others, however, right? You have, for example, and again, not in a. I'll try to go somewhat in a historical order, right? You have Rav Shimshon Hirsch. Rav Shimshon Hirsch lives in Germany in the late 19th century. Sammy just did something on it. He could probably tell us all about it. If you'd like, you could do your presentation. And he lives at the time of the Emancipation, right? And one of the things that, for those of us who know what comes afterwards in Europe, the Emancipation was a time of great hope for the Jews, right? The Jews had always had certain, they'd been limited to certain types of jobs. They were limited to certain places. They couldn't go to universities. And also in the 19th century, little by little across Europe, the Jews start to be emancipated. And of course they start to assimilate and they start to become part of Europe. And there was this assumption that finally, the Jews were no longer going to be hated. And again, looking back with what comes later on, it seems a little ironic. But Hirsch comes along and he says, he looks back and he says, let's look at the story a little differently of Yaakov and Eisav. First of all, what does it say? It says that Eisav cries when he hugs Yaakov. And he says, he cries. He has this love for him. You have this idea that it comes along, and he says, if a strong person is nice to a strong person, that doesn't mean that he's kind, right? Why is he doing that? It's being smart. Like if two superpowers, are nice to each other, they're not doing this, they love each other, they're doing it because, you might not want to have a war. But he says, but here's Eisav, strong Eisav, the hunter, hugging weak Yaakov, this very weak man. And what does that start to show? Rav Hirsch says, the Christians are going to become civilized. He says they are represented by Eisav, but they're going to hug us, and they're going to accept us, right? Eisav, even though it said that he's going to live by his sword, he's going to become influenced by the Jews. Right now, again, according to Rav Shimshon Hirsch, what was supposed to happen is the Jews were going to keep the Torah, and once we kept the Torah, we were going to influence the Christians. They were going to put down their sword, and they were going to become influenced by us. And not only that, Esav's also going to teach us, according to Rav Hirsch, right? Because according to Rav Shimshon Hirsch, it's so interesting what he does is, who are these 400 men that Esav has? He's a king. He's a leader, right? As opposed to the Jews who have been in Galut, where Yaakov has his family, Yaakov has possessions, but he doesn't have a people. He's now coming back to Eisav, and Eisav is hugging him, and he's going to, the Jews are going to come out of Galut, and the Christians are going to show them how to be, political leaders, how to be kings. And again, so he sees this kind of coming together of the Jewish people. And of course, ironically, he's writing this in Germany in the late 1800s, less than 70 years before the Holocaust. Although again, at least somewhat to, I suppose if you were going to answer for him, he'd say, well, the Jews didn't really keep their end of the promise in terms of really being the Or Lagoyim they were supposed to be. But again, you have Rav Herschel saying in theory that there's this possibility that the Christians and Jews, that it's not going to end up, that yes, the Christians are Eisav, but rather than the way that we've been learning it up until now, where finally God is going to, pay the Christians back, pay the Romans back for what they did to us, that, it's going to end in brotherhood. That's one possibility. You have Rav Kook, right? It says in the beginning of Sefer Malachi, again, one of the last of the Trei Asar. Right? It says in Sefer Malachi, it starts off right at the beginning, and it says, right? It says right over here, Masad Dvar Hashem al Yisrael biyad Malachi, Ahafti etchem amar Hashem. I love you, says God. And then it skips a little bit in Pasuk Gimel ve'Eisav saneti. I hate Eisav. Now that sounds pretty clear. But the Vilna Gaon comes along, Rav Kook quotes this, the Vilna Gaon comes along and says, it doesn't mean that I hate all of Eisav. There's a part of Eisav that I hate. According to the Vilna Gaon, who again, he's living in Lithuania in the late 19th and in the late 18th century, so it's not exactly like the Lithuanians were never big fans of the Jews, very much to this day, but he says that there's this idea that again, that God doesn't really hate all of Eisav, that there's a certain aspect of him that God hates, but that Eisav can be redeemed. And then the Nitziv, who lives at the end of the last century, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, he also comes along and he says that if the Jews will be redeemed, right? In other words, he points out very interestingly, when is it that Eisav and Yaakov end up together? What is Yaakov at first? The name Yaakov, where does it come from?
The ankle.
The heel, right? The Akev is the heel, right? Yaakov is this sneaky, wily guy. He gets the bracha not by, openly confronting it. He doesn't tell his father, I bought it. He sneaks and he has this whole scheming plan. When does Eisav finally start respecting him? When he becomes Yisrael, after he wrestles with the angel. He goes from this kind of like Weasley guy who kind of gets things, in very sneaky ways, to Yisrael, who has this ability, head on, he confronts things. He's willing to confront Eisav head on, and all of a sudden, Eisav respects him. So you have this whole...
He goes from being Sephardic to being Ashkenazi, thus representing all of Israel.
Right. No, so you have this idea that, again, a number of the Achronim have this idea that somehow it's possible they're going to end up together. Right? And I saw, very interestingly, we even say this in Lecha Dodi, right? It says, Yaminu small tifrotzi, right? You will spread out to the right and the left. So there's this professor, Ruvain Kimmelman, I think his name is. He's a professor at Brandeis. And he wrote a book on, Lecha Dodi, by the way. It's like, we sing it as this cute, nice song. Oh, it's so lovey-dovey. It's got all sorts of sexual imagery. It's got all sorts of... There's a lot of crazy stuff going on there. There's a lot of Kabbalah going on there. But according to this professor, when it says Yaminu small tifrotzi, what does it mean? Who's to the right and to the left of the Jewish people? The Christians and the Muslims, and then ultimately the Jews are going to spread out. The Muslims and the Christians are going to join up with the Jews, and by Yomahu Yeh Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. According to Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, at least within this reading, that again it's not going to be the Jews being victorious and God killing all the bad evil goyim who have made us suffer over the years, but in the end they're going to come. We're all going to serve one God together. So there starts to be this fairly positive view that maybe that again there can be some sort of reconciliation. One exception to that rule is the Beit Halevi, Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, not the one who was at YU, but his great grandfather, who says, because what does it say? He says, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Eisav, right? And Beit Halevi, he says, you know what? The Christians, they're always going to come after us. Again, he has this idea again that typology, they're always Eisav, they're never going to love us. Eisav, Soneih, Yaakov. And what does it mean? So why Achi and why Eisav? Sometimes they try to get us by being Eisav, concentration camps and pogroms and, burning us at the stake. And sometimes that doesn't work, and they try to be our friend. They try to be nice to us. Oh, we want to help you. We're on your side. We're just, we're helping you find the Jewish Messiah. And the Beit HaLevi, says that even when they appear to be nice to us, it's really part of destroying us. And the truth is, there is that, to this day, there's that voice that exists where people say that when the Christians are nice to us, they're really doing it because they want to convert us. And of course, one thing that's important, even though when we're talking about the Christians, there's of course many different approaches to Christianity. And, now, just to wrap this up, the real irony is, again, so the Jews living in the Middle Ages who, and the Jews who are living, the Tanaim and the Amoraim who are living among the Romans and the Christians, it's very easy for them to see the Christians and Rome as Eisav because they're suffering under them. And then you start to have those like Rav Hirsch and the Netziv and Rav Kook who start to say, there's a different way the story could end. Rather than Eisav being defeated and killed, we're all going to end up brothers. And that sounds really, really nice, except for the fact that you look at it, that all these people, including Rav Hirsch, who was from Germany, and Rav Kook, who dies in 1935, and the Netziv, I don't remember when he dies, but certainly before the Holocaust as well, they don't see the Holocaust that comes up. And of course the Holocaust, even though again, Nazi Germany was not a Christian country, a lot of people feel, to this very day that the Nazis really could not have succeeded the way they did if it wasn't for centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. In other words, they went into, the Christian countries that they went into, especially in Eastern Europe, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, the Nazis barely needed to lift up their fingers over there. Given the chance to finally wipe out the Jews, they had a field day. And, so that's the thing. Living in the 19th century with emancipation, you might be able to look at the world and say, finally, brotherly love, the Jews are going to be, after the Holocaust, everything changes. And this brings me to the last thing that Professor Brill sent to me. He sent me this article about this Israeli poet. I'd never heard of him before. Very, very fascinating guy. His name was Uri Tzvi Greenberg. And Uri Tzvi Greenberg comes from a Hasidic family and was not, stopped being religious and became a little bit of and became a writer and a poet. Became a fairly famous Israeli poet, famous enough that he's on Wikipedia, right? And he did actually return somewhat to observance, and he also was very, very, very right wing. I don't know if you guys know, in terms of before the formation of the State of Israel, there were different groups when it came to how to deal with the British. Some of them were much more into reconciliation, and some under Jabotinsky, and Begin was part of this, were much more about fighting the British. Much more about the sense that, the British aren't going to give us anything and we're going to have to take it. And Uri Tzvi Greenberg joins up, that's the side that he's on. He ultimately even becomes, at the beginning of Israel, becomes a member of the Knesset. And his poetry, leading up in this time, in the 20s and 30s, he's writing a lot about blood. But not blood of the Jews being killed, but that, we need to become spillers of blood. We need to become almost like Eisav. We need to be that, and it's almost like Rav Hirsch is saying, that we need to be toughened up by but we need to become Eisav-like, that we can't just be these meek Jews of Galut, but we have to be willing to spill blood, and the Jewish land is going to be sanctified by blood, and we're going to acquire our land by blood. And again, it's this very kind of macho, that whole, Chalutzi kind of, we're going to conquer the land, we're going to defeat the British, we're going to defeat the Arabs. Chalutzi? Like the Chalutzim, in terms of there was this very anti-Galut kind of mentality among the founders of the State of Israel, that the old, mostly Ashkenazi, European Jews who were these, with their hats and their peyot and all this, stuff, and they were all hated and despised, and they were weak. And we are we're the new Jew, and we're the strong kind of Jew, and that's what Uri Tzvi Greenberg represented. And then came the Holocaust. And all of a sudden he continues writing about blood afterwards, but all of a sudden the blood that he's writing about is no longer about the blood that we need to spill, but our blood that has been spilled. And, again, in terms of, do we end off this with a pessimistic view or an optimistic view? I guess it's sort of mixed. Certainly the, I certainly don't buy into the idea, Eisav, Soneih, Yaakov. I have, Christian friends who I think are wonderful people, and I think that there's, certainly we're living, post 1962, when the Vatican, said that the Jews are no longer responsible for killing Jesus and all these things. We're living in a time when the Jews and the church have a closer relationship. But we're also living not that far after the Holocaust. And again, so the rosy dreams of, the 19th century, that the Jews, if they just became normal, that they would just become part of the world, and that we could just, that we would be just another group of Europeans. That hasn't come true also. So, again, is this some sort of, divine thing that the Christians will always hate us until the time? I'd like to think not. I'd like to think that there's a chance not, and that, maybe to some degree the different people who see these things, they all see what they want to see. It's like that Rorschach test, for people who have suffered a lot, whether in the Middle Ages or under the Romans, or post-Holocaust, it's very easy to say Eisav, Soneih, at Yaakov. For those of us who kind of live in America where things have been pretty good, it's easy for us to say, it could be better. But hopefully, I'd like to think that somehow, whether it's because of a divine plan or just because, after a century of, between, Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia and, communist China and Vietnam and, Cambodia, all these things. Well, right. All these things that maybe the world is moving towards a place where, the spilling of blood is not, the way that we settle things, and it's not, and maybe if not literally, in terms of, Yaakov and Eisav coming together, but hopefully the people of the world, we can stop hating each other, and we can, come recognize that, one way or another, we're all, trying to serve the same God.
I think there's more of like